and we are on episode number 19. Today, we're still talking about National Caregivers Month, so stay tuned.
Real homies wanna know.
Real homies wanna know. Real homies wanna know.
Our homies wanna know.
Alright, so guys, today, like I said, we're talking about National Caregivers Month still, and in doing that, Ashley and I, the Dementia Guru, we had a chance to sit down and talk with Aisha Adkins, who is a storyteller, an advocate, and a caregiver. And on top of that, she is a millennial. So, let me just stop talking and let's get to it. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Christina and Ashley. I really appreciate it. You mentioned I'm a storyteller, an advocate, and a caregiver. I really didn't expect to be any of those things. I figured early on, when I was back in college, that I would work with young adults as a social worker. But after I graduated, about 2 years after that, my mother started exhibiting symptoms of early onset dementia. And we did not recognize them as such at the time, but we eventually went on to get several diagnoses, a few which were misdiagnoses, and finally she received a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia in the spring of 2013. And I have been her caregiver ever since. I looked for resources for caregivers, but particularly for young adults, and that were really culturally applicable to Black folks. I really saw kind of an absence, and I really started wanting to share my story and tell people kind of, what it's like being a young adult caregiver, and share some of the challenges that are unique to our set of circumstances.
I found your page from an article that I read that talked about caregivers who are millennials, and you were featured in there, and then it took me to your website, and you've got this long list of resources. You even came up with a checklist of things that people should know, who are caregivers or starting out as a caregiver, and it was really helpful for me. I mean, I'm not in that position, but it was helpful to know.
I did not know that you're a social worker, so cheers to fellow social workers. I am a social worker also, so that's awesome.
One of the things that I had to realize over time is that I needed to prioritize the things that I wanted to do in life. Early on, when I first became a caregiver, I was in my late 20s, and I was frustrated because I found that my life looked very different from that of my peers. People were, going to the clubs and meeting their significant others, getting married, landing their dream job. And my life just didn't look like that. And I finally kind of realized that, as long as I continue to compare my life and measure where I'm at up against, others' lives, that I'll never be content, I'll never be happy, and I'll never get anything done. I'll never be able to focus on providing care for my mother, or, kind of creating a future for myself and reaching some of my own goals. And so I had to really sit down and pray about and think about what's important to me. And I discovered that that's still helping people. That's never changed. Spending time with my family now and realizing that time is not guaranteed in the future, but that, someone somewhere will always be hiring. So that quote unquote dream job, it could be an opportunity for me to kind of work on myself. I prioritized my health. I actually went on a journey to get healthier. I was diagnosed as pre-diabetic around the time that my mother was diagnosed with dementia. And I was having all sorts of symptoms that people don't talk about with diabetes. I had severe migraines, and I was starting to get a blind spot in my right eye. And I realized, gosh, my mother can't do anything about her condition at this point, but there's still time for me to make some changes. And so, so really focusing on my health, getting myself, to a place where I could be of the most help to my mother, was really important to me. And then, taking another look at education. And, there are so many, and I think a lot of people are discovering this with, since the pandemic, there are a lot of different ways to get a really great education. And I actually found a program that worked really well for me at Georgia State University that would allow me to still study something that I'm interested in, but to do so at my own pace that was conducive to being in a caregiving situation. So once I really narrowed down my priorities, I realized, going out with friends, while it's still important to socialize, it just didn't come as high on my list of priorities. And I found ways to interact with my peers that are more meaningful. I've even developed new friendships through support groups that I'm involved in that in some ways are probably stronger than some of the friendships that I've developed elsewhere. So, once I really was able to do that, it made such a difference in my, my life. But that being said, I realized that I can't do it all. And there are days when I'm just flat out exhausted, but prioritizing my health, I think, and my family have been the biggest game changers for me.
I like that. And I like how you mentioned the whole comparison thing and also being content, because I feel like that's something a lot of us go through, where we are constantly looking at other people smiling and enjoying their lives, and then we look at ourselves and we're like, why don't I have that smile, or why don't I have this same feeling that other people are showing, social media, all that good stuff. And it's like, so then you are in this funk and you don't even realize how you got there. It's like just being content with where you are, even if it's uncomfortable or something you didn't see coming, but working with what you had and like what you did, you thought outside the box.
And just to kind of add to that, I really love what you said about just taking a step back and reflecting and kind of prioritizing what's most important to you, what's important in your life, the relationships that are important. And like you said, some relationships are going to change, and it's really good to hear that you found a support group where now maybe even those relationships are even more stronger than your previous relationships because of the caregiving role that you've taken on. So,
to look at your resources, look at what's available to you, because caregiving oftentimes, falls to one person. I'm an only child, but even in families where there might be 6 or 7 siblings, it's often the case that there's one person who is kind of designated the caregiver unofficially. But what I found early on is making sure that I get access to the resources that I may need. So whether it was educating myself as much as possible about dementia, about the treatments that are available, because there is no cure for dementia, and it is a progressive degenerative disease, which means that, as time goes on, it will continue to get worse, right? But understanding that there are some medications that may help to slow the progression of the disease or to help control some of the symptoms is really helpful. Understanding, my rights as my mother's caregiver, and, kind of as a co-patient. That's sort of how I view myself with her. When I accompany her to appointments, sometimes it can be intimidating for people to go into a physician's office, especially if it's a specialist. We see neurologists, we see neuropsychiatrists, and sometimes that can be really intimidating for folks. But understanding that one, doctors are just people, and they are imperfect. They are capable of being wrong. They are capable of making mistakes. They're also capable of helping you if you need that help. But understanding that they're not people to be afraid of, but that they're still people, I think kind of puts, again, it's about perspective, and it puts that relationship in perspective. It's okay to assert yourself. You can be kind, but also disagree, and you don't have to be afraid to speak up and to voice your concerns, to ask physicians to take another look at test results, and then we also are familiar with the cultural biases that sometimes happen within the medical field, and so there's sometimes concern about combating that, but being confident that you are doing your best to do what's right for your loved one, I think is very important. Another form of resource, is also looking at who's in your network. People often say, gosh, let us know if you need anything, or, we're here for you. And then we say, okay, well, thank you, but I'm fine. And we're really not fine. And I think you would be surprised if you were honest with people and said, gosh, you know what? I really could use, a break. I could use a break this week. If you wouldn't mind coming over for, an hour or two so I can, go to the grocery store. Reaching out, I would say the third thing is reaching out to associations and organizations that are affiliated with the condition that your loved one is dealing with. So every major city has a area agency on aging for older adults, and so there are tons of resources through them as well that you can take advantage of. So that a lot of people don't identify as caregivers. Many people, I was unfamiliar with the term when I first became a caregiver. And I think, perhaps our doctor or, our family physician or someone may have mentioned the term. And once I heard that, that became my keyword that I would type into all of the internet searches that I did. And then I began to have a relationship with it. But it's just not something that was on my radar. It's not something you hear in most, young people's vernacular. It's not something that comes up in conversation, even if that's a role that we are actively playing because we are, helping someone fix dinner, and we're helping someone, get into and out of the bed or brush their teeth. That oftentimes, we kind of just fall into assisting with these things, but we don't assign a label to it. But if you are on a regular basis, assisting someone in this way, it can even be, helping someone pay their bills or reminding your, grandmother to take her medication, things like that. All of those things can make someone a caregiver. Getting people to acknowledge that and to understand that, I think, is something that's a work in progress, which is part of why I created Our Turn to Care, was just to raise awareness that young marginalized folks can be even further marginalized by now being a part of this demographic called a caregiver. But I think there is something to be said for sharing our stories and for reaching out to folks within these multicultural support groups that I've discovered. I've been able to build relationships with folks I identify with in terms of age, but also in terms of race. I recall folks asking, well, why should race matter? And okay, the high level, it shouldn't, right? None of that should matter. It's a social construct anyway, right? But the reality is that race impacts the way that we experience life. Everything from the way that we experience the healthcare system, to our communities, to the things that we have access to. So the way that I interact with life as a caregiver, but also as a Black woman in her 30s, is going to be different than that of someone who is, who is a white man in his 60s or 70s, who's maybe caring for a spouse, whereas I'm caring for a parent. Perhaps he's already retired and he's relying on pension or, Social Security, whereas I am trying to figure out career alternatives. And yes, there are some similarities for all caregivers, but then there are these nuances that simply just make the experience different. It's, we're not trying to compare wounds. It's not about that. It's just acknowledging that it can be a very, very different experience. And as such, support for those nuances is desperately needed. And there needs to be greater education around, the systemic challenges that Black and Brown folks face that further exacerbate the experience of being a caregiver.
We just appreciate your time and
thank you.
You're a wealth of knowledge. Thank you for what you're doing for caregivers.
I hope that the information that Aisha shared was very helpful, and be sure to look her up on social media at Our Turn, the number 2, Care. And then she also has a website, which is www.ourturn2care.com. In